Greetings, council members. My name is Matt Hahn. I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me this evening. And I'll kick it off with a discussion of why we're here and what we're facing. To summarize the problem that you all have asked me to research and look into, what we're seeing in the past couple of weeks is an increasing number of fish kills in our aquatic environments. There's a lot of concern in the community about the danger this could represent for our swimmers. Obviously, with dead fish lying on the beach, we've seen already a loss in tourism revenue. And one consideration we haven't discussed, but I think is worth considering, has there been an impact to our commercial fisheries or to our recreational fishing, which is also a source of tourism revenue for us. So my findings, what I did once I was contacted and asked to look into this, I've gone ahead and tested the water. And what I found is our water contains a very high parts per million of cyanide. When I say very high, I mean an amount that's over recommended safety margins. Sodium cyanide is water soluble and it's a toxic compound. And when I say toxic, I mean it's toxic to both aquatic life and to humans. So it's pretty serious. Before I get into more details about that, I just wanted to give everyone in the room an overview. I know you're not all scientists like myself, so I'm going to talk about molecules, and I'll start off with a brief discussion of the chemical structures that we see in molecules. This is a basic description that refers to the way that atoms are arranged within molecules. Generally, they form functional groups, which are groups of atoms that occur within organic molecules, and they confer specific chemical properties to those molecules. In very general terms, there's typically two classifications. They're either hydrophilic or hydrophobic. Hydrophilic molecules are what we call water-loving, and hydrophobic are molecules that are water-fearing. Generally, they sit in different key functional groups. Some of those are called hydroxyl, methyl, carbonyl, amino, carboxyl, phosphate, and sulfohydryl. And these groups are responsible, or I should say they play an important role in the formation of molecules like DNA, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, things that are extremely essential to the foundation and functioning of most life forms on our planet. The way that these molecules interact with each other is generally based on the charge that they have. One might be slightly positive or negative, and that'll make a bond with the converse more likely. Typical bonds: covalent, ionic, hydrogen, and something called a van der Waals interaction. Now I'll get into specifics about cyanide. Now that we've got a little bit of knowledge about molecules in general, the cyanide chemical formula is effectively a carbon atom triple bonded to a nitrogen atom. The form I think we're seeing in the water environments is actually sodium cyanide, which is NaCN. It does take other forms. There's potassium cyanide and hydrogen cyanide. Those all fall into the functional cyano group, which is also known as a nitrile. The non-toxic forms that you do find when we talk about cyanide, ferrocyanide and potassium ferrocyanide, are non-toxic versions of this molecule. The bond between carbon and nitrogen in this case is called a covalent bond. And this type of molecule, which is significant to later on in our discussion, this is a hydrophilic or water-loving molecule, and that'll be important later on. Before I get into more specifics on cyanide and what it does, I'm going to give you a bit of background about the functions of fish. We're going to start actually at the smallest level, or the molecular level. Fish are made up of eukaryotic cells. These are types of cells that generally all complex life on our planet is based on, effectively. It's a cell that has a membrane-bound nucleus and several other membrane-bound components or sacs. Generally, these are referred to as organelles. Organelles, or little organs, perform many critical functions in the cells to keep them alive and enable them to divide or reproduce. Some examples of organelles are the nucleus, which carries the DNA or the information necessary for the cell to carry out its functions, and also divide and create new cells. The mitochondria, which I would describe as the energy factory of the cell, and we'll be discussing that in more detail, and the lysosome, which is effectively the stomach of the cell. How these cells produce energy and use energy, generally energy generation is performed inside of the mitochondria, as I mentioned, that energy factory. The majority of it is produced through a process called the electron transfer chain, or ETC. The energy released by that process is stored in ATP, and at which time the cells need access to that stored energy, it's released by a process called phosphorylation. And when we talk about energy, we have to talk about metabolic reactions. As I mentioned, that ETC, or electron transfer train, is part of one of the broad metabolic reactions that take place inside a cell called oxidative phosphorylation. Generally, that takes place in 3 steps: the oxidation process, and then a gradient is created. And from there, the electrons are passed through a series of chemical reactions to a final electron receptor, which is called oxygen. As these electrons are passed down the chain, each time they lose a little bit of energy. That energy is captured and stored in ATP. And this 3rd step in the process of oxidative phosphorylation is called the electron transfer chain, which I've mentioned already. The enzymes that are the 4 enzymes that are key to the ETC are protein complexes 1 through 4. And in general terms, when we talk about enzymes, and when we talk about all these functions, we're talking about functions that take place very similar in humans and aquatic life and fish specifically. And when we look at these metabolic reactions, generally the more active an enzyme is, the higher the output from whatever process they're catalyzing. Conversely, when those enzymes are inhibited or restricted, that process they're involved with will be dialed down or even turned off completely. And there's 2 general forms of inhibition. Competitive inhibition takes place when the inhibitor molecule binds to the receptor site, effectively outcompeting the substrate, the enzyme that catalyzes that reaction. So basically, the inhibitor molecule gets there first and stops binding. In non-competitive inhibition, that inhibition or inhibitor molecule binds to an allosteric site, which still prevents binding of the substrate, or it actually creates a conformational change in the enzyme, and that change prevents the enzyme from catalyzing the reaction. So now we've got a general understanding of molecules and a general understanding of what's happening inside the fish. I want to talk about cyanide's toxicity to fish. And where I'm going to start is how it enters the cell. And so I'm not talking about how it enters the environment. We're going to start off with how cyanide, once in the environment, enters the fish or the fish's cells. And as was mentioned earlier, cyanide's extremely reactive with metals. This is an important point. The cyanide binds to the iron atom that's present in the enzyme complex 4. It is able to do so because there are a variable number of electrons in the 2 outer layers of the iron atom, and this is almost a ready-made bonding site. A lot of natural processes take advantage of this structure of the iron atom. In this case, though, cyanide is hijacking it and really stalling the ETC, or the electron transfer chain. Effectively, cyanide in this process becomes a permanent enzyme inhibitor, prevents oxygen from entering the ETC, effectively turning the process off. The cells are unable to produce energy. Eventually they die. The tissues and organs that those cells are a part of die, and not soon after, the organism itself perishes. The specific organelle impacted is the mitochondria. The electron transfer chain is inside the mitochondria. And something interesting that I found in my research, unlike humans, the red blood cells of fish actually have mitochondria. And effectively, any mitochondria is affected because that's where the electron transfer chain is. That's where the reaction that cyanide blocks takes place. That's where the damage is done. A rule of thumb when it comes to cyanide toxicity, whatever cell or organelle or tissue or organ uses more or the most oxygen, that's where the damage done by cyanide is the greatest. So a couple of good examples of organs in both fish and humans that rely on a lot of oxygen are the heart and the brain. And that makes them highly susceptible to cyanide poisoning. And obviously those are critical to the function of life and so can be lethal when they're disrupted. So we know how cyanide enters the cell, but how does it get into the fish? I think the most likely scenario here is through the gills. In general terms, I think we all know this. Fish swim around. The purpose or the reason why fish can't stop swimming is they are continually absorbing dissolved oxygen through their gills and into the bloodstream. And I think this is the most likely entry point for cyanide that's in their aquatic environment to enter the fish itself. I think it's unlikely, though not impossible, that the cyanide's getting into the fish through ingestion because cyanide is highly soluble, meaning it dissolves very quickly in water and also has very low persistence in aquatic environments. And the fish gills are relatively new. I think it's unlikely but not impossible that this has gotten into the food chain and having food chain be the source of the cyanide we're seeing in these fish. Okay, so we know how cyanide gets into cells. We know how it gets into fish. We now are going to talk about how it gets into the water. I think there are two main avenues that I'm hypothesizing are the source of the cyanide. And so when we look at industrial processes, there are several that have a heavy use of cyanide, and that wastewater generally goes to wastewater treatment facilities where the water is treated and then released into the environment. We'll talk in more detail about this, but when those plants are overwhelmed by heavy rainfall or flooding, storm surge, etc., they get overwhelmed, and there's untreated water that runs off and runs out of them and into the local environments. And the second and probably most likely major source of cyanide in our environment is from mining activity. Sodium cyanide is really heavily relied upon in the mining industry because, as we mentioned earlier, it's high reactivity with metal. It's sprayed onto the gold ore. It forms an MCN bond with gold, which then creates a solution that contains gold and is readily soluble. That solution's leached off. The gold is stripped out of the solution. It's sprayed back onto the ore, and that process is repeated until there's no more gold left in the ore. As a result of processes like this, we do see a lot of cyanide wastewater from mining activities. But we've had wastewater treatment facilities and mining activities in our region for many, many years. And so the question then becomes, if it's cyanide and it's coming from those sources, why is it suddenly appearing in our aquatic environments? And I think the most likely answer, in the past couple of weeks, we've had several major storms, including one that was a Category 3 hurricane with a storm surge of roughly 8 to 12 feet. On top of that, when this storm made landfall, it was what we call a king tide, which is effectively an extremely high tide, and coupled with heavy rainfall, over 2 inches recorded. I surmise that both the mining facilities were overwhelmed with flooding water, and so their safety and reclamation equipment was just completely overwhelmed. So they have equipment that's designed to take the cyanide out of the water before it gets released back into the environment. But with this amount and volume of water flooding through the area, those systems are totally overwhelmed. And I would argue the same goes for our wastewater treatment plants that were also completely overwhelmed with floodwater.